So welcome at the last session of this event. After we heard about the challenges that we're facing, the problems with corruption, state capture, organized crime, how it could be investigated, how it could be sanctioned. With this session, we like to look forward and try to predict the future in a way, so that we are prepared, better prepared for a post-war world. So we'll try to see, based on past experiences, if we can predict how the organized crime groups will change their operation, how the EU accession will play out through a new methodology, and how we as a civil society can participate in the process. Of course, after all types of crises, after a pandemic, after a war, there will be a lot of recovery funds in our countries, in other countries. We as civil society have the role to be the watchdogs and to see that all these funds are transparently distributed and they contribute to the rule of law. And in case of any new criminal trends or new fraud schemes have emerged during these times of crisis, we need to identify them and we need to counter them. So we have two speakers today. The first one is Sasa Djordjevic, Field Coordinator for Serbia and Montenegro at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime in Belgrade, Serbia. He previously worked for almost 12 years as a researcher at the Serbian-based think tank Belgrade Center for Security Policy, covering police reform, community policing, and hooliganism. And he's also enrolled for a PhD studies at the Faculty of Criminal Justice and Security in Slovenia. And he'll tell us more about how illicit financial flows progress or are changed during times of conflict. So, Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for participants that actually decided to stay at this last panel and talk with us. So feel free to interrupt me, whatever you think you have any questions to me. I want to be like more informal discussion and talk about the future, especially because the war is still ongoing on. And first thing, what I wanted to say, like the dress code. And I don't know if you watch like the TV show is called Ozark. Yes, and basically the Ozark is about illicit financial flows, but inside the United States, like between different states in United States. And I think it's very good because you can see different foreign influence, for example, from Mexican organized crime and whatever. And basically, so we are now, so the war is in Ukraine is like lasts for more than 1 year. And what is the future? So this is like the answer on this question is basically like for the Nobel Prize, and it's very difficult. And I want to, like, because we are in Belgrade, that the capital of state that also was under embargo during the 19th. And I think it's very important for this topic to actually to find out what are the lessons learned from that period, what we can learn from that period that actually can help us to find some new solutions to tackle illicit financial flows. So as you know, Serbia, ex-former Yugoslavia, was during the 90s 2 times under sanctions. The first time was between 1992 and 1995, and after that in 1999. and basically illicit financial flows skyrocketed during time, especially for goods that was high demand in the country. One is fuel, and the second is cigarettes. So everybody needs like a water, and everybody, especially in this region in the Balkans, need like cigarettes, and cigarettes are quite good for the soldiers, etc. And basically this market, like fuel and cigarettes, actually created completely new illicit trade forms in the Balkans. So before the Balkans, before the war in the ex-Yugoslavia, so actually there was no cooperation between criminals between Balkan countries. So there are no lines. And actually, when the war started and the embargo and sanctions, so criminals from Serbia and Montenegro started to cooperate with the fellows from Romania, from Bulgaria, from North Macedonia, and especially in these in illicit trades of this in high demand goods. And this is essentially, if you look at the definitions, the illicit financial flows. And basically what happened after that, so that everything was coordinated, planned, there was like different numbers of criminal organizations that actually established criminal networks. And basically when one of the first lessons after the war ended in the former Yugoslavia, there is a born of new criminal elite. So after 2009, and I will just mention one because I mentioned like the fuel, probably some of you know, especially those people who are from Serbia, about the old mafia, about the fuel mafia. So basically some of the members of that criminal organization were active during the 90s and bring like illicit capital and everything. And actually in 2006 and 2007, because of the new crisis, because of the situation in Kosovo, actually they use that situation and bring like new profit for the, and what is the good in that story, that they were arrested in 2007, but actually the final verdict was in 2016, so almost 9 years after the trial started. So this is like one. So the second lesson from the wars in former Yugoslavia during embargo, actually that all illicit financial flows were enabled, and actually it was like the push factor by the corruption and the political protection of illicit trade. And there are a lot of intermediaries in this business. And actually, again, I will talk about the fuel smuggling. So one of the companies with thousands of employees in the former Yugoslavia was very important for illicit financial flows. So basically, they acted as a company that imported fuel from Romania at lower prices, and they sell to local distribution market in Serbia and Montenegro, but actually for the lower prices. And that earnings, they never actually reported those earnings to the central bank, to the different financial institutions, and basically they use and share that profit between themselves. And basically from that business, so-called tycoons and everything was created as a consequence of embargo and everything. What is that's the second war. So basically a lot of these people actually use that illicit capital to start new, not necessary illicit business, but actually legal business. And the third lessons from the war, that actually porous borders. And at that time, borders between former republics of Yugoslavia has not yet to be like finished completely. They are not still, because the war is ongoing. And actually that porous border, there are no checks and everything, border checks. They actually were the push factor for the illicit financial flow, especially for one channel, which is cash. And I like Vanya comment from the first panel that cash is the king right now of the illicit financial flows, but actually still now. We recently published one report about like illicit markets on the airports in the southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, and actually we can see with the case studies of airport Belgrade and Skopje, and we can see that we actually, during analysis, saw that airports are critical infrastructure that actually use people and criminals to smuggle a lot of cash. So we are discussing a lot right now about cryptocurrencies, digital, but actually the cash is still the king. And that's the third lesson. And the final lesson, I think this is very about the environmental damage of the illicit financial flows. So basically, for example, also again, fuel smuggling. So there are a lot of leaks of fuels, and during embargo of former Yugoslavia, so basically all smuggling operations were conducted on the national resources, like Danube, like Silver Lake in Serbia, like Skadar Lake in Montenegro. So basically, and nobody, like even like 20, 30 years after those crises, nobody actually conducted what is the damage on the environment from illicit financial flows. And I think this is completely new angle, but it's quite important. So this is like the 4 lessons from the embargo, but what is different right now? We have like the war in Ukraine, and one big difference is that actually during the Balkans criminal organization, they didn't have cooperation among them like before the war started, but right now, and wasn't so high in criminality during the 80s and 90s. But actually right now we have the opposite situation. According to the Global Organized Crime Index, both actors in this conflict, Russia and Ukraine, are high in criminality. So Russia is first in Europe, Ukraine is third in Europe. And actually, we also have like a huge links between Ukrainian and Russian mafia. So this is like a completely new momentum in formulating different strategies to actually attack illicit financial flows. And sanctions are one of the solutions. Especially, I think these sanctions that are targeting specific companies and individuals are much more better than have like more productive ways than, I don't know, broad sanctions like we have, like, because what we have, for example, what is the experience from the Balkans, that people in the Balkans, especially in Serbia, actually because of sanctions, they united and like and created completely new wave of criminals. I probably someone of you knows about the Dizelaši, Diesel Boys. So this is basically the new criminal elite that actually burn. But right now in Ukraine, we have like much more developed stadiums of organized crime development, which could like foster different illicit activities much more faster. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The first questions that come to my mind is, can you tell us more a little bit what happened in our region? What happened with this new criminal elite, with these tycoons? You said that sometimes they could start a legal business with this dirty money. Are they still in the legal business or not? If they're in the legal business, do they in some way influence the policymakers stopping the adoption of legislation such as the transparency of ultimate beneficial ownership, the anti-corruption strategies, and regarding Russia and Ukraine, what are your predictions? Do you think that after the war, these more coordinated two mafias that are currently developing new joint operations, is there a threat from them to meddle with the policy, with the absorption of recovery funds? What challenges do you see there?
in my opinion, I think like criminal. We actually right now we have like different illicit markets from Ukraine and Russia to Europe. So, for example, arms smuggling. So, and the entry point is again the Balkans, especially like a country like Romania in this region. And right now, I think criminal organizations from these two countries are in much more better position than the Balkan criminal organizations. So they have like much more profit, much more money, and they have like infrastructure. So this is like all these elements were not like not existed before the wars in the former Yugoslavia started. I think this is like one of the, and that's why the response must be much more clever. And for this, yeah, so basically after the wars, so during 2000s and after, so basically we have like two new criminal elites. One is tycoons, and basically to minimize risk and to use new opportunities like to profit. So basically they kept close cooperations with political parties. So this is one, and like privatization of state-owned companies was one of the solutions like for influx of their money. And on the other hand, we have like, I call that local entrepreneurs. So basically people that, because border areas between the country is much more important for the smuggling, and they use like infrastructure, network, and illicit capital from the previous period to start new business in those border areas. And for example, for the fuel smuggling, so some people that actually from Serbia were active in fuel smuggling during 90s, they created new companies with huge legal distribution of and everything, and very rich now. Yes.
Okay, since we have only two speakers, I suggest that now we ask questions from the audience. To Sasha, yes. Do we have the microphone? Yes.
No.
Okay, any other, anyone wants to ask a question?
Maybe at the end, yeah.
Okay, not for now, maybe later. Okay, so now let's move to our next speaker. We have with us Strahinja Subotic. He's program manager and senior researcher at the European Policy Center here in Belgrade. And he joined in early 2017 as a head of the Europe and US program area.
Us. Europe and us.
Okay. His key fields of expertise are the enlargement policy and EU affairs. His other areas of expertise include geopolitics and the involvement of external actors such as China, Russia, and Turkey in the Western Balkans. He is currently pursuing a PhD degree at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade. So, Strahinja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to build upon what was previously said. I mean, the previous speaker really covered it quite well and detailed. However, I'd like to a bit zoom out the story and reflect on the title of today's event. On my way here, I thought about the title, and the word that stuck in my mind was the word alliances. The title goes, Rebuilding Political and Economic Alliances. I think this topic is relevant, particularly as we are living in a process that I might call an acceleration of history. So many things are happening in such a brief period of time that were previously a bit difficult to imagine. So in that sense, first thing that popped up in my mind is that we need to add one more word in the title, and that is social, political, economic, and social alliances, because I think with the ongoing geopolitical developments, We're witnessing a realignment of political interests, economic cooperation, but also fight for hearts and minds of citizens. So any alliances also need to take into account the importance of, in that regard, soft power and the fact that the political, economic, and social elements are deeply intertwined. Then another thing that I thought of is whether the partnership which we have between the Western Balkans and the EU, could it be defined as an alliance, as a sort of a de facto alliance? Our countries have signed their own trade agreements with the EU. We have booming economic cooperation that's been increasing ever since those agreements have been signed. We don't need visas to travel, and we have, at least on paper, political cooperation that is ongoing. However, is this really enough to define our relationship as a de facto alliance? And then when I thought about the word alliance, the words that popped in my mind were mutual trust, mutual support, then I wrote down shared goals, effective communication, proactivity, commitment, conflict resolution mechanism, flexibility, adaptability, and finally, a long-term perspective. So now I invite you, the audience, to, when you think of those words, do they pop in your minds when you think about the alliance or the de facto partnership between EU and Western Balkans? I don't think so. Like most, or if not all of those elements which I previously listed, I believe are currently missing from the ongoing developments in terms of our relationship and partnership between the EU and the Western Balkans, particularly in the case of Serbia. I would argue that we have opposite of alliance. We have distrust. We have often diverging goals and interests. We have ineffective communication on both sides, a passive approach, short-term orientation, passivity, moderate support, weak or non-existent conflict resolution mechanisms, rigidness of the approach, and unclear perspective. I think this is a worrying sign, and if nothing is done to change, I think we'll continue with the ongoing status quo, which will only open the gates for criminal activities, for conflicts to get unfrozen, frozen conflicts to get unfrozen, and to cause additional instability in the region. I think this is something we need to avoid, particularly considering that the war in Ukraine should have been a big wake-up call for all of us. I recently came from Budapest. I'm going next week to Paris. So I'm on my way to actually advocate for self-reflection, not only by our governments, but also by the EU, because the EU has its own fair share of responsibility of this situation we're currently in. For example, we had Juncker saying when he took office 2014-15 that during his term no enlargement will take place. That killed the dream of enlargement. Then we had the Brussels Agreement signed in 2013, and again nothing happened. The community of Serbian associations was never established. Then people forget we had trade war between Croatia, a member state of the EU, and Serbia for a while, and then also we had the trade war, we can call it, between Kosovo and Serbia. Then we had the name change in Macedonia. They changed the name and nothing happened. Furthermore, when the pandemic started, and this I was told of this by Mr. Lajčák, and I quote, the EU simply forgot about the Western Balkans when it started, which effectively opened the door for geopolitical actors such as China to come in and swoop the hearts and minds of Serbian citizens and have really negative impact on EU's leverage. Then we had some hopes that the economic and investment plan could change some things. However, out of the 30 billion package, only 9 billion are actually grants, whereas others are loans and credit guarantees, which are actually not something which we need. We need more loans, we need more grants. And finally, we had sanctioning packages. For example, when the EU adopted the fourth sanctioning package, they simply forgot again about the Western Balkans, and they had to, when it came to imposing restrictions on Russia, they imposed restrictions on our firms, which actually deal with Russian, whereas they didn't impose those sanctions on the EU firms. So they, a month later, a few weeks later, they gave some exemptions to our companies, but the damage was already done. So the EU has always been proactive and too passive in their approach. On our side, we can take a look at Serbia. Simply by examining this month, May 2023, can illuminate all the flaws our society is currently faced with. Just in this month alone, after unfortunate and tragic mass shootings, we saw prime example of how democratic regression can take place or is taking place. We saw media bias, counter-protests, unprofessional journalism, institutional leakages to the public of information that was supposed to be secret and sensitive. Then we had the rise of political polarization and tensions, hate speech, fake news, and on top of all of that, we had Kosovo. So if anybody wants to study Serbia, it's enough for them to take a look at this as a case study by looking at this month, May 2023. So this applies ever since Serbia opened the accession talks, and it was a tango which danced with the flaws the EU had on its side. And I know this sounds a bit pessimistic, but I hope at the next our discussion, I can actually tell you what could be done actually to bring back hope and strive for, allow us to achieve those requirements for an alliance to be achieved hopefully as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, but you really piqued our interest, and I simply cannot not ask you what is the solution that you see. Can you very shortly summarize what is the staged accession model that you recommend?
Okay, building upon everything I've said, I can conclude that not just people of Serbia, but it's also the people of the Western Balkans, they've become tired, dissatisfied, and hopeless. Tired because the process has been ongoing for a while. When I'm asked, for example, by Germans, why are you so tired? You've opened the talks just 9 years ago. But I tell them we opened our talks in 2000, on 5th of October. That's when the dream starts. So it's been more than 2 decade long dream. So people are tired. And I'm afraid this tiredness might increase in the region. Then they're satisfied. The accession process has simply not provided the necessary benefits to keep the dream alive. We had the visa liberalization in 2009, and that's it. We later on open clusters, close chapters, but that doesn't change a thing. And the Commission, I always tell them that this is not even a one-day news anymore in Serbia. It's not a sufficient and tangible incentive for citizens to keep believing in the European dream. And finally, they are hopeless because if you look at the polls, majority of people here, absolute majority, believes will never become members of the EU. So you can't expect them willing to make compromises with Kosovo or to impose sanctions on Russia or to keep their governments accountable, to risk their lives in a way for something that might never happen. That's a better European future. And in this context, we provided in 2021 something that we named a staged accession model. We developed it with our partners from Brussels, the Center for European Policy Studies, realizing the fears which I just named, that the process needs to be broken down in several bits and pieces. For example, we can address the fact that people are tired by the fact we provide incentives per stage. So we argue, you achieve a certain level of preparedness across clusters, you're eligible to acquire certain benefits which were previously unavailable to your government and to your country. And that's how we address the second issue, dissatisfaction. We as a European Policy Center argue that incentives should be given across stages in terms of financial incentives and in terms of institutional incentives. In terms of financial incentives, as I previously mentioned, the current IPA, the pre-accession funds, are simply insufficient to tackle the increasing socioeconomic gap between the EU and the Western Balkan average. Some people argue that this IPA is even smaller than the previous one if you take into account the inflation. So we argued that per stages, or that is, if a country progresses and fulfills certain criteria, it should be allowed to reap the financial benefits so it can actually start preparing its administration to reap the benefits of future membership, but also to show to citizens that the EU is serious to invest in our European common future. So, my colleague Anna and I have actually, and we'll publish a paper soon, calculated how much it will cost to apply per stage the financial incentives if a country of the region progresses. And secondly, we argue for the necessity to include the institutional incentives. We argue, for example, if Montenegro is fully aligned with EU sanctions against Russia, why shouldn't it be allowed to sit at the Foreign Affairs Council in the European Union? On the other hand, Serbia hasn't applied any sanctions, and what's the difference? It doesn't make a difference. Yet applying those sanctions in standards of our countries is quite costly. Therefore, institutional incentives should be given to those countries who make progress, but who also provide and showcase political commitment to the shared goals and values. And that's another paper that I've covered. I actually argue that it is possible to actually open the gates of the Council, European Parliament, Commission expert groups, and comitology. I believe that this could be a strong impetus for reforms because this could allow our leaders to sit with the EU leaders. They could be held accountable if the commitments are missing, but at the same time our expert level could be socialized with how EU policymaking is done in practice. So by combining financial and institutional incentives, we hope that actually things could change, that actually the EU could argue that they are serious, they're committed, that they're proactive, that they are adaptable, and that they want to increase mutual assistance and support. So these are all elements which are previously tackled when I was trying to define the element of alliance. But naturally, this is not a shortcut. I'm not trying to say that Serbia should get more funds overnight, that we should be sitting in all of those bodies. No, this is contingent on the fact that we would need to apply certain level of reforms. And I think this has been lacking so far. For example, Serbia has acquired 600 million euros for a road, and for what? We didn't increase our standards in rule of law. We want to change the dynamic. We want to say a country which implements certain levels of reforms, let's imagine Macedonia, it should be the one to actually get those funds and institutional access. So we try to link the reforms with the rewards. And we hope that both the Western Balkan leaders would endorse this model. We try to talk to them on a daily basis about it, but also EU member states, because even EU member states can profit largely from this, because not only does our model build upon the revised methodology, because it's the revised methodology which argues we should give institutional and financial benefits early on in the process, and to abandon the binary approach where we have membership and not membership. No, we try to build the links and make the alliance stronger early on. We also argued that for having this privileged status in the pre-accession stages, by having more money institutional access, we should argue that as a compromise, newcomers should renounce in certain areas their veto rights upon their accession to EU. This way, we could give EU more time to actually reform itself, to maybe reduce the number of areas in which vetoes might be needed. And finally, for us to showcase that we're not going to regress even upon becoming members of the EU. And to conclude, as one minister from Macedonia once told us, membership for our citizens in the European Union is not about veto rights. It's about having the EU citizenship, EU passport, 4 freedoms, ability to study, work, and move wherever they want across the European continent. And I hope that with this model, it could also potentially be extended to be applied in Ukraine and other candidate and aspirant countries, and this way to really build a strong European alliance. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting indeed. Maybe stage by stage, countries could build capacity, alliances, obtain necessary funding to do reforms, but it is also reversible. If a country stops the reforming itself, the money will also be stopped.
I had to omit some parts. We have 15 papers and they'll be published by the end of June. So I invite you to check our website. Thanks.
So check the website. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, one question, if we can have the microphone.
Yeah, thank you both. My name is David Jackson from U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Centre. I actually have a question for Sasha. Sasha? Yeah. What was your name?
Yeah, Sasha.
Sasha, okay, good. Okay, I got it nearly right. So it's on the role of the private sector, actually, and their complicity or not with organised crime in the region. And I ask this because so Western governments and the Ukrainian government are already thinking about reconstruction, the form it's going to take, what needs to be done, how it should be governed. And some Western governments in particular are pushing for high levels of private sector involvement. So the London conference, which will happen next week, Recovery Conference, that will only be about how the private sector will and should be involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine. And the Americans and the Canadians too are also pushing for private sector investment. So this isn't a loaded question, I really don't know the answer, but from your research from the region in the past couple of decades, to what extent have organized criminal groups worked with private sector companies from the West, multinational Western companies, or from the other perspective, to what extent have Western companies exploited the situation of informality, organized crime to pursue profits and build up their interests? So, thank you.
Thanks. So, about private sector, so I think they are quite important actor. And from experience from the Balkans in the 80s and after that, so most organized criminal organization actually developed their own private sector. But the problem is the lack of control and a lot of intermediaries in the business. And I will tell you, for example, right now, reconstruction of Ukraine is a future. But right now, the current problem, for example, is that Bulgaria and Croatia are only country in the EU that can import Russian oil. And there is basically news, and they cannot export that oil to other EU member states. But because of the situation, lack of energy, etc., they can they can import from Russia, and actually through refineries in Bulgaria produce different fuel products, petroleum products. And what is going on? Because there is not only one company, but there are, like, for example, more than 500 companies that actually are in the business with the Bulgarian refinery company. And it's completely impossible to control that. And I watched, for example, Ivica today chart about, he actually explained, like, I don't know, 6 or 7 associates and how they are connected. But right now you have like 500 companies that actually are part of the business. And in that sense, and this is only fuel. I'm not talking about reconstruction. Reconstruction will be the huge problem. And right now, if you look, for example, in the Western Balkans, what are the main typologies of money laundering? You will always have from the civil society, but also from the government, that actually the construction sector is the main targets of professional money launderers, where they actually invest and put their illegal money. And this will be, I think, in my opinion, will be happen also in Ukraine, because there will be a huge opportunity, like to launder dirty money from different illicit markets. And that's why I think, like, strict audit, for your question, the strict audit of companies that actually are involved in construction in construction buildings and everything should be conducted. I think this is one of the, on how they actually, do they have like financial reports sometimes, how they conduct audits, etc. I think this is quite important. If we forgot about that, so it's not like the period after the Second World War and the Marshall Plan and everything. So this is completely new time, and I think that actually a lot of interest. We also have the similar situation after like conflicts in Afghanistan and Syria, that actually, again, from United States, a lot of private actors enter the market. And it's not like the best solution, I think. So it depends what actually big players in the world, what they want. So this is like they can mask all audits and everything if they want like to profit from the construction and rebuilding of Ukraine. I'm quite pessimistic, sorry, but yeah.
Yeah, just to add to the discussion, or if they apply, for instance, the revised Red FIDIC agreement for constructing public infrastructure, as for instance now we see an agreement between the government and Bechtel-Enka in Skopje, where actually if you look at the agreement, then you see a big opportunity of first Bechtel-Enka being recused of any other partner of the actions of any other subcontractor, like legally recused through the special law, and then they can just funnel the money. And I think it's more a question of whether Ukraine can have sufficient governance standards to be able to resist pressures from the private sector from abroad, regardless from where it comes, because that will be, for instance, our government actually waived the opportunity of using EU money just to be able to agree lucratively with Bechtel-Enka and use our own money, I mean the taxpayers' money, just because of more higher standards by the IPA funding than the tailor-made law. So I think it's a bigger problem or whether Ukraine can actually resist this pressure from the big private sector actors.
Yeah, true. I think like the subcontractors are huge risk, especially those without portfolio in building. But actually they can make portfolio during the years of construction. That's a huge problem. And for example, that's from experience in Serbia. We have like a huge infrastructure project, and if you look like for the tenders, at the beginning, like a company that nobody knows. They don't have anything, they actually won the tender because of political ties and everything. But after 10 years, they already have portfolio. And this could be, and like construction of Ukraine will not like be done for, I don't know, 1 or 2 years, it will be a long process. So, and the audit, not of only big players, but also like of these subcontractors, because if you look like of the network of all these illicit financial flows, you can see that there are so many players inside that it's like a spider web in the end. So, and it's important. But actually, I think if big players don't want to stop that, that will be mission impossible for Tom Cruise. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also have a question for Strahinja. Misha Popovic from the Institute for Democracy, sorry for not introducing earlier. Can you comment on if we are to think about the future and in particularly the enlargement future of the Western Balkans, can you briefly comment on two types of generational change that we experience now or we are going to experience soon, and that is kind of the political position or ethos of the average youth in the Western Balkans, particularly their relationship with big democratization stories, and whether that is important for this new generation or not. And on the other hand, the shift, the expected shift in the EU and the probable significant rise of the radical right, basically joining in higher numbers the European Parliament in the future, and how this will affect the mutual trust and in general the relationship with the Western Balkans.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll start with the EU side. I think before Brexit, everybody was afraid of far-right movements and whether they have enough capacity and potential to disrupt the functioning of the union and even to dissolve it in some like far-fetched scenario. But ever since Brexit happened, I think even the right-wingers, including Marine Le Pen in France, for example, even they started softening a little bit, toning down their willingness to be as critical of the EU as they were before Brexit took place. They just saw how much our societies are politically, economically, and socially intertwined with each other. Because the union has been ongoing for decades now, and in that sense, they knew it would be costly to repeat this exercise of Brexit in their own country. So, even if we imagine Le Pen coming, because this is second Macron's term ending, even if we imagine coming to power, I don't see her necessarily disrupting the union in that sense. I could see her slowing down the integrative processes, but yeah, in terms of enlargement, we have yet to see. Of course, enlargement is unpopular among the French, has been typically unpopular among the French. However, we've seen that with the start of the war in Ukraine, there are shifts in terms of public perception of enlargement, including in traditionally skeptical member states. So I think eventually the Western Balkans will try to ride this wave of enlargement, which is primarily related to Ukraine. But I argue when I go to member states, if you're unable to integrate a country of 500,000 people, such as Montenegro, what could you do, and what do you expect to do with Ukraine? So I think the EU can also use this opportunity to practice on our case, to showcase that it's still an appealing entity, and that it's an entity which has the potential to integrate other countries. But of course, as Macron says, internal reforms will be needed. Macron rightly says that an increased number of players, veto players, might render decision-making process difficult in the process, and that's what Marine Le Pen argues as well. But with our model, as I previously mentioned, newcomers would have their veto rights limited for a certain period of time, let's imagine 10 years, and we hope that this could be actually an argument that could even bring to our side even those who are a bit skeptical of further enlargements. But as I mentioned, the public opinion in the EU seems to be shifting, and I hope that we can ride the wave as well. The only one who is not witnessing any shifts is Turkey. Like if you ask them about Turkey, Turkey is a no-go. And I think with the re-election of Erdogan, that can be left aside permanently. And when it comes to our societies, if I'm not mistaken, public opinion shows that unfortunately youngsters are the ones to be a bit pessimistic about enlargement or even disinterested. Like 1/3 could be in favor, 1/3 against, and 1/3 indifferent, which is an alarming message, which argues that more tangible benefits are needed, as I previously mentioned. And recently, for example, how it could be done. Recently, I was at the airport, and we were sitting in a line full of people coming all over from the world, and we were just going to a Brussels visit for one day. And then an idea popped in our minds: why not give EU candidate countries the right to take the same airport lane as do have member states of the EU? Because this is already applied to non-member states, such as EEA members, such as Norway, or even to Switzerland. That's why you see EU, EEA, Switzerland. Imagine adding or WB, Western Balkans, to having such a small change. I think could allow the EU to show commitment and to target youth. Particularly the youth are the ones who study, who travel the most, and so on and so forth. But the answer is not simple, of course. But Serbia, out of all the country, faces the most issues in terms of public support. And that's actually an argument that we don't have too much time to waste. When we originally proposed this idea, for example, again, I always mention the Germans, they told us, it's been just a year that we adopted a revised methodology. But we argued it's too much. A year is too much. And we knew that more time will pass, nothing will happen. And more time passed, and nothing has happened. That's why we argue we don't have time to lose, and I hope that our advocacy can give some fruits. Our biggest impact so far in that regard has been the fact the European Council in June 2022 publicly endorsed the idea of gradual integration. So it called the Commission, the Council, and the High Representative to work out the details of this notion of gradual integration or staged accession. And therefore, I'll try to be hopeful and send a message that we can be productive in the following period.
Any other questions? No. If not, I would like to thank you very much for being here, to staying until the end. I hope that all of us learned something useful today. What I personally learned is that we live in a very dynamic world where everything becomes more and more complex. The information technologies are developing. They could be used for good, like using big data to provide transparency, but they could also be used for evil, to spread disinformation. So all of us need to learn. We need to learn how to investigate financial crimes. We need to learn how to prosecute them, and we need to learn how to better work with each other and with the policymakers to improve the procedures and the legislations and to move forward the reforms. So thank you again for being here with us. If you're interested in our work, please take a copy of our paper report. It's available here at the registration. Follow our website. We'll keep you updated of our future research. And I also like to invite you all at the closing event, which we're currently planning to be in Sofia on 9th of November. It's still a tentative date, but we'll send you more news by email during the end of the year. So thank you again, and see you next time.
Thanks.